Gee. The morning sun peeked through the windows of Atlanta General Hospital as Sarah Johnson hurried through the bustling corridors. At 32 years old, she had been working as a nurse in the rehabilitation ward for the past 5 years, and every day brought new challenges and experiences. Her dark skin glowed with warmth as she greeted her colleagues, her braided hair neatly tied back in a professional bun. "Sarah, we have a new patient in room 205. Her supervisor called out as she reached the nurse's station. He was transferred from the intensive care unit last night. Could you handle his morning checkup? Of course, Sarah replied, picking up the patient's chart. She quickly read through the details. Michael Thompson, age 34, construction worker, paralyzed from the waist down after a severe workplace accident 3 weeks ago. The words on the paper were clinical and straightforward, but they represented a life forever changed. As Sarah approached room 205, she heard someone laughing. The sound was unexpected, especially coming from a room housing a recently paralyzed patient. She paused at the doorway, surprised to see a man sitting up in bed, sharing a joke with one of the orderlies. "Good morning," Sarah said, entering the room. "I'm Sarah Johnson, and I'll be your primary nurse during your stay here." Michael Thompson turned to look at her, and their eyes met. Despite his condition, his face lit up with a genuine smile that reached his warm brown eyes. "Nice to meet you, Sarah. I'm Michael, but I guess you already know that," he said, gesturing to the chart in her hands. As Sarah began her routine checks, she couldn't help but notice how different Michael was from other patients she had treated. Most people who recently suffered life-altering injuries struggled with depression and anger, but Michael maintained a positive attitude that was both refreshing and intriguing. "You seem to be in good spirits," Sarah commented as she checked his vital signs. Michael adjusted himself in the bed, his movements careful but determined. "Well, I figure being sad won't help me get better. Besides, I'm lucky to be alive. That steel beam could have hit my head instead of my back." Sarah found herself drawn into conversation with him as she worked. She learned that he had been supervising a construction project when a support beam gave way. His quick thinking had saved 2 of his workers, but he couldn't move fast enough to completely save himself. "My mom says I've always tried to be the hero," he chuckled, though Sarah noticed a flash of sadness cross his face. "Now I have to learn to be my own hero, I guess." As Sarah checked his circulation and leg movement, she explained each procedure clearly. Michael listened attentively, asking intelligent questions about his condition and recovery prospects. His genuine interest in understanding his situation impressed her. "You know," he said while she was recording his blood pressure, "some of the doctors talk about my condition like I'm not even in the room. It's nice to have someone who explains things properly." Sarah smiled, remembering why she had become a nurse in the first place. "Everyone deserves to understand what's happening to their own body," she replied. "And understanding leads to better healing." Before she left the room, Michael called out, "Will you be back tomorrow?" "Yes, I'm assigned to this ward for the next few weeks," Sarah answered. "Good," he said with that warm smile again. "It's nice to have a friendly face around." As Sarah finished her rounds that day, she found her thoughts returning to room 205. There was something special about Michael Thompson, not just his unexpected optimism, but his whole approach to his situation. In her 5 years of nursing, she had never met a patient quite like him. Later that evening, as she was updating patient records, Sarah's colleague Lisa stopped by her desk. "I see you met Mr. Thompson today," Lisa said with a knowing smile. "He's quite different, isn't he?" Sarah nodded, trying to maintain her professional demeanor. "He has a good attitude. That will help a lot with his rehabilitation." But as she drove home that night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this particular patient would leave a lasting impression on her life. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself looking forward to her shifts at the hospital more than ever before. Every time she entered room 205, Michael greeted her with that same warm smile that made her heart skip a beat. She tried to keep things professional, but there was something about him that made it difficult to maintain the usual distance she kept with patients. One morning, while helping Michael with his physical therapy exercises, she noticed him wincing in pain. "We can take a break if you need to," she suggested, concerned about pushing him too hard. "No," Michael said firmly, sweat beading on his forehead. "I need to get stronger. My mother's coming to visit today, and I want to show her I'm making progress." Sarah had heard about Mrs. Thompson from other nurses. She was a wealthy woman who had already visited twice, each time leaving the nursing staff exhausted from her demanding behavior and countless questions about her son's care. Later that day, Sarah was checking Michael's vital signs when Mrs. Thompson arrived. The older woman walked in wearing an expensive suit, her gray hair perfectly styled. She took one look at Sarah and frowned. "Michael, dear," Mrs. Thompson said, barely acknowledging Sarah's presence, "I found a wonderful private facility in Switzerland. They specialize in spinal injuries, and I think we should consider transferring you there." Sarah felt her heart sink at these words, but kept her face neutral as she continued her work. "Mom," Michael said firmly, "we talked about this. I'm staying here. The team is excellent, and I'm making good progress." Mrs. Thompson's eyes flickered to Sarah, who was adjusting Michael's pillows. "Well, I just think you could get better care elsewhere. More appropriate care." The meaning behind her words was clear, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn. She had dealt with prejudice before, but it still stung every time. "Mom," Michael's voice was sharp, "Sarah is the best nurse I've had. She's professional, caring, and she actually treats me like a person, not just a patient." Sarah quietly excused herself from the room, giving them privacy for what was clearly becoming a heated discussion. As she walked away, she could hear Michael defending her and the hospital staff. That evening, as Sarah was preparing to end her shift, she found Michael sitting in his wheelchair by the window in the hospital's small garden. The setting sun cast long shadows across the grass. "I'm sorry about my mother," he said as she approached. She's having a hard time accepting everything that's happened. The accident, my condition, and," he hesitated, "and the fact that I might be interested in someone she doesn't approve of." Sarah's heart raced at his words. "Michael, I'm your nurse. It wouldn't be appropriate." "I know," he interrupted, "but I won't be your patient forever. I'm being discharged next week." Sarah hadn't known this, and the news hit her harder than she expected. That's wonderful news," she managed to say. "Would you have coffee with me?" Michael asked suddenly. "After I'm discharged, I mean. Not as a patient and nurse, but just as Michael and Sarah." Sarah looked at him, sitting there in his wheelchair with hope in his eyes. She thought about all the obstacles they would face: his mother's disapproval, society's prejudices, his ongoing recovery. But she also thought about his courage, his kindness, and the way he made her feel whenever she was around him. "Yes," she found herself saying, "I'd like that." Michael's face broke into that beautiful smile she had grown to love. "I promise you won't regret it," he said softly. As Sarah walked to her car that evening, she knew she was breaking one of her personal rules about getting involved with former patients. But sometimes, she thought, the most beautiful things in life happened when you were brave enough to break the rules. What she didn't know was that their coffee date would be just the beginning of a journey that would test their love, challenge their beliefs, and ultimately lead to the biggest surprise of her life. 6 months had passed since Michael's discharge from the hospital, and his life had changed in ways he never expected. That first coffee date with Sarah had turned into dinner dates, movie nights, and countless hours of conversation. Despite his wheelchair, Sarah never made him feel less than whole. On this particular evening, they sat in Sarah's small apartment, sharing takeout Chinese food. Michael watched as Sarah laughed at something on TV, her braids falling over her shoulders. He couldn't believe how lucky he was. "What are you staring at?" Sarah asked, catching his gaze. "Just the most beautiful woman I've ever met," Michael replied, making Sarah blush. She still wasn't used to his compliments, even after all these months. But their relationship wasn't without its challenges. Just last week, they had faced another uncomfortable incident at a restaurant. The waiter had automatically handed Sarah the bill, assuming she was Michael's caregiver rather than his girlfriend. And then there were the stares they got in public, some curious, some disapproving, at the sight of an interracial couple where one person was in a wheelchair. "My mother called again today," Michael said, putting down his chopsticks. "She wants to set me up with her friend's daughter. I told her I'm perfectly happy with you, but she won't listen." Sarah sighed. Mrs. Thompson had been relentless in her attempts to break them up. She tried everything from guilt trips to offering Michael a position in her company if he'd come to his senses. "Maybe she's right," Sarah said quietly. Your life would be easier with someone else. Someone more like. Don't, Michael interrupted firmly. Don't even finish that sentence. I don't want easier, I want you. He wheeled himself closer to her, taking her hands in his. Sarah Johnson, you've seen me at my worst. You've helped me learn to live again. You've never once made me feel less than a man, despite this wheelchair. And I don't care what anyone else thinks. Not my mother, not strangers on the street, not anyone. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. But your family will learn to accept us, or they'll miss out on being part of our happiness, Michael said. Then, to Sarah's surprise, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. I had planned to do this differently, he said, his hand slightly shaking. I was going to take you to that park where we had our first real date. But sitting here, seeing you worry about our future, I realize there's no better time than now. Sarah's heart stopped as Michael opened the box, revealing a beautiful diamond ring. Sarah Johnson, I love you. I love your strength, your kindness, your smile, and the way you see the real me beyond this wheelchair. Will you marry me? For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she looked at the man before her, the man who had captured her heart with his courage, his humor, and his unwavering love. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes, yes, yes. Michael slipped the ring onto her finger, and Sarah threw her arms around him, nearly knocking over his wheelchair in her excitement. Later that night, after Michael had gone home, Sarah called her best friend Lisa to share the news. Girl, are you sure about this? Lisa asked. You know it won't be easy. Sarah looked at the ring sparkling on her finger. The best things in life usually aren't easy, she replied, but they're worth fighting for. As she got ready for bed that night, Sarah couldn't stop smiling. She knew there would be challenges ahead, Mrs. Thompson's disapproval, society's prejudices, and the everyday challenges of being married to someone with a disability. But she also knew that their love was stronger than any obstacle they might face. What Sarah didn't know was that the biggest challenge, and the biggest surprise, was still to come. As she began planning their wedding, she had no idea that Michael was keeping a secret that would change everything. Wedding planning turned out to be more complicated than Sarah had imagined. On this bright Saturday morning, she sat at Michael's kitchen table, surrounded by brochures of wedding venues. Her notebook was filled with questions about wheelchair accessibility, ramp angles, and door widths, details she never thought she'd need to consider for her wedding day. This one looks perfect, Sarah said, pointing to a beautiful garden venue. They already have ramps installed, and the bathrooms are fully accessible. Michael wheeled himself closer to look at the brochure, but before he could respond, his sister Amy burst into the kitchen. Sarah noticed how Amy quickly shoved something into her pocket. It looked like some kind of medical paper. Oh, I didn't know you'd be here so early, Sarah, Amy said, looking flustered. She exchanged a quick glance with Michael that made Sarah feel uneasy. Is everything okay? Sarah asked, looking between the siblings. Of course, Amy answered too quickly. Just some family business. Nothing important. This wasn't the first time Sarah had noticed strange behavior from Michael's family. Last week, she had overheard Mrs. Thompson talking in hushed tones on the phone. Yes, doctor, he's been making excellent progress, but we're keeping it quiet for now. Michael cleared his throat. So, about that garden venue. But Sarah's mind was elsewhere. She remembered how Michael had missed their dinner date 2 days ago, claiming he had a routine medical checkup. When she offered to go with him, he had quickly refused, saying it wasn't necessary. Michael, Sarah said slowly, is there something you're not telling me? What? No, of course not, Michael replied, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. Sarah had been a nurse long enough to know when someone was hiding medical information. Just then, Michael's phone buzzed. He quickly grabbed it, but not before Sarah caught a glimpse of the message. Physical therapy appointment confirmed for 3 p.m. Another routine checkup, Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Yes, Michael stammered. Just regular maintenance, you know how it is. Amy suddenly became very interested in organizing the brochures on the table. Sarah noticed her hands were shaking slightly. You've been having a lot of those lately, Sarah observed. And they're always at times when I can't come with you. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Amy mumbled something about needing to make a phone call and practically ran from the kitchen. Sarah reached across the table and took Michael's hand. Whatever it is, you can tell me. We're getting married. There shouldn't be secrets between us. Michael squeezed her hand but remained silent. His eyes looked troubled, and Sarah could tell he was struggling with something. I love you, she continued. Nothing you tell me will change that. I know, Michael said softly. And I love you too. More than anything. That's why. He paused, running his hands through his hair in frustration. That's why this is so complicated. Before Sarah could press further, Mrs. Thompson walked in. She stopped short when she saw Sarah, and there was that same guilty look Sarah had seen on Amy's face. Michael, dear, Mrs. Thompson said, carefully avoiding Sarah's gaze, don't forget your appointment this afternoon. It's very important. Mom, Michael warned, but the damage was done. Sarah stood up, gathering her things. I think I need some air, she said. And I think all of you need to decide whether you trust me enough to be part of this family. As she walked to her car, Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes. She was a nurse. She knew when something medical was going on. Why wouldn't Michael trust her with the truth? What could be so important that his entire family was keeping it secret? Little did she know, the answers to her questions would come sooner than she expected, and they would change everything she thought she knew about her future with Michael. Sarah couldn't sleep that night after leaving Michael's house. Something wasn't right, and her nursing instincts wouldn't let her rest. The next morning, she drove back to Michael's house, determined to find answers. She knew he had physical therapy on Sundays, so the house would be empty. Using the spare key Michael had given her for emergencies, Sarah let herself in. She felt guilty about snooping, but her worry for Michael's health overshadowed her guilt. As a nurse, she had seen too many patients hide serious medical conditions from their loved ones. Just a quick look at his medical files, she whispered to herself, walking to his home office. Just to make sure he's okay. Sarah opened the bottom drawer of his desk where he kept important documents. Her hands trembled as she sorted through the papers. Birth certificate, insurance papers, old hospital bills, and then she found it. A thick manila envelope marked Experimental Treatment Program, Confidential. Her heart pounding, Sarah opened the envelope. As she read the first page, she had to sit down, her legs suddenly weak. Participant, Michael Thompson. Diagnosis, incomplete spinal cord injury T10-T12. Treatment, neural regeneration therapy. Success rate, 85% chance of significant recovery. Current status, positive response to treatment. Patient showing increased sensation and muscle control in lower extremities. Sarah's hands shook as she continued reading. The documents detailed an experimental treatment program that Michael had been participating in for the past 3 months. The treatment combined stem cell therapy with innovative electrical stimulation techniques. According to the progress notes, Michael had been regaining sensation in his legs. Oh my God, Sarah whispered, reading further. He's learning to walk again. The latest progress report, dated just 3 days ago, was even more shocking. Patient demonstrates ability to stand with minimal support. Short distance walking possible with assistance. Prognosis for independent walking within 6 to 8 months. Excellent. Tears rolled down Sarah's cheeks as she read the notes. Pictures were attached showing Michael in a specialized therapy center, standing between parallel bars, his face concentrated and determined. The dates showed he had been going to therapy 3 times a week, always when she was working her hospital shifts. Another document caught her eye, a handwritten letter from Michael to his doctor. I know keeping this treatment secret isn't ideal, especially for my fiancée, but I can't bear to give her false hope. If this doesn't work, it would break her heart all over again. And if it does work, I want to give her the surprise of a lifetime at our wedding. Please continue to maintain confidentiality. Sarah sat back in the chair, overwhelmed by what she had discovered. The mysterious appointments, the hushed phone calls, Amy's strange behavior. It all made sense now. Michael wasn't sick or hiding bad news. He was fighting to walk again, trying to give her an incredible wedding gift. Just then, she heard the front door open. Panicked, Sarah quickly tried to put the documents back in order. Sarah? Michael's voice called out. Is that you? Your car's in the driveway. She heard the whir of his wheelchair coming down the hallway. Looking at the scattered medical papers on the desk, Sarah knew she couldn't hide what she'd found. She wiped her tears and turned to face the door just as Michael appeared. He took one look at the papers on the desk and the open manila envelope, and his face fell. "You weren't supposed to find out like this," he said quietly. Sarah stood up, her legs still shaky. "Were you ever going to tell me?" "Yes," Michael replied. "On our wedding day, when I stood up from my wheelchair to meet you at the altar." Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, fresh tears flowing. Everything she thought she knew about their future had just changed dramatically. But first, they needed to have a very long talk about trust, secrets, and why you don't hide medical miracles from your nurse fiancé. The silence in Michael's home office felt heavy as they stared at each other. The medical papers lay scattered on the desk between them, each page revealing the secret Michael had tried so hard to keep. "I can explain," Michael started, wheeling himself closer to Sarah. "Explain?" Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "Explain why you didn't tell me, a nurse, your future wife, that you were getting feeling back in your legs. Explain why your whole family has been lying to me." Michael reached for her hand, but Sarah stepped back. Her nursing training kicked in as she picked up one of the medical reports. "Neural regeneration therapy, experimental treatment. Michael, do you know how dangerous this could be? What if something had gone wrong?" Her professional concern mixed with personal hurt. "That's exactly why I didn't tell you," Michael said softly. "I knew you'd worry. As a nurse, you've seen all the things that can go wrong. I didn't want you to carry that burden." Sarah paced the room, her emotions swirling. "But I'm not just your nurse anymore. I'm supposed to be your partner. Partners share things, especially big things like learning to walk again." Michael wheeled to the window, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "I wanted it to be perfect," he admitted. "I had this whole scene planned in my head. On our wedding day, when everyone thought I'd roll down the aisle, I would stand up. The look on your face, it was going to be magical." "And what if it didn't work?" Sarah asked, her voice gentler now. "What if the treatment failed?" "Then nobody would know I had tried," Michael said quietly. "Nobody would be disappointed, especially not you." Sarah knelt in front of his wheelchair, taking his hands in hers. "Michael Thompson, when will you understand? I fell in love with you, not your ability to walk. Whether you're in this chair or dancing down the aisle, I love you." Tears formed in Michael's eyes. "I know that, but ever since the accident, I've had to depend on others. Just once, I wanted to be the one giving something amazing, not receiving help." "But you've given me so much," Sarah insisted. "You've given me love, laughter, strength. You've shown me what real courage looks like." Michael touched her face gently. "I'm sorry for keeping this from you. I got so caught up in the idea of surprising you. Mom, Amy, even my doctors, they'd all thought it would be this incredible moment." Sarah stood up, wiping her eyes. "Show me," she said suddenly. "What?" "Show me what you can do now. No more secrets, no more waiting for the perfect moment. Show me." Michael hesitated, then nodded. He wheeled himself to the parallel bars he kept hidden in his home gym. Sarah watched, her heart pounding, as he positioned himself. Slowly, gripping the bars tightly, Michael began to push himself up. His arms trembled with effort, but his legs were moving. Sarah covered her mouth as she watched him stand, wobbly but upright. "I can only manage a few steps," he said, sweat beading on his forehead. "And I need a lot of support." "Take those steps," Sarah whispered. "I'm right here." Incredibly slowly, Michael moved one foot forward, then another. 3 shaky steps before he had to sit back in his wheelchair, exhausted but smiling. Sarah rushed to him, wrapping him in a tight hug. "You amazing, wonderful, incredibly frustrating man," she said through happy tears. "So, am I forgiven for keeping the secret?" Sarah pulled back to look at him. "On one condition. From now on, we do this together. Every therapy session, every triumph, every setback, together." Michael nodded, relief flooding his face. "Together," he agreed. "Though I should warn you, physical therapy at 6 a.m. isn't pretty." "Good thing I'm used to early mornings at the hospital," Sarah laughed, then turned serious. "And Michael, thank you for showing me. It wasn't the surprise you planned, but it was still magical." What they didn't know then was that this moment of honesty would lead to an even more incredible journey than either of them had imagined. Over the next 3 months, Sarah and Michael fell into a new routine. Every morning at 6 a.m., they would arrive at the rehabilitation center together. The other patients soon got used to seeing the nurse who would come in her scrubs before her hospital shift, helping her fiancé with his exercises. "Come on, Michael. Just 2 more steps," Sarah encouraged, walking backward in front of him as he gripped the parallel bars. Sweat dripped down his face, but his determination never wavered. "Trying to boss me around already, future Mrs. Thompson?" Michael joked, though his arms shook with effort. Sarah had learned that humor was his way of pushing through the hardest moments. Dr. Rodriguez, the head of the experimental treatment program, watched from the corner, making notes. "The combination of the neural therapy and his dedication is producing remarkable results," she told Sarah during one of their breaks. "His progress is exceeding our expectations." And it was true. Week by week, Michael's steps became stronger. From meeting full support of the parallel bars, he progressed to using a walker. The first time he took 3 steps with just a cane. Sarah had burst into happy tears, not caring that she was already late for her shift at the hospital. But it wasn't all success stories and victories. There were hard days too. Days when Michael's legs wouldn't cooperate, when the pain was too intense, when progress seemed to move backward instead of forward. One particularly difficult morning, Michael fell during his exercises. Sarah rushed to help him up, but he pushed her hands away in frustration. "I can't do this," he said, his voice breaking. "Maybe we should just cancel the whole walking down the aisle plan. I don't want to ruin our wedding day if I fall." Sarah sat down on the floor beside him, not caring about her clean scrubs. "Remember what you told me when we first started dating? That being sad won't help you get better?" Michael nodded slowly. "Well, being afraid won't help either," she continued. "If you fall at our wedding, I'll help you up. If you need to use the wheelchair, we'll use it. What matters is that we're together." Their wedding was now just 1 month away, and everyone was working extra hard. Mrs. Thompson, who had finally accepted Sarah after seeing her dedication to Michael's recovery, hired the best physical therapists for additional sessions. "I was wrong about you," Mrs. Thompson admitted to Sarah one day, watching Michael practice walking in the parallel bars. "You're exactly what my son needs." Even Amy got involved, secretly measuring the church aisle so Michael could practice the exact distance he would need to walk. The most touching moment came when Michael's construction crew visited him at therapy. These tough men, who had been there the day of his accident, watched with tears in their eyes as their boss took steps towards them. "Boss man, you're going to make us all cry at your wedding," his foreman Jake said, wiping his eyes. Sarah found herself falling even more in love with Michael during this time. His strength wasn't just in his improving physical abilities, but in his spirit. Even on the hardest days, he never gave up. One evening, after a particularly successful therapy session where Michael had walked 15 steps with just a cane, they sat in their favorite coffee shop. "You know," Michael said, stirring his coffee, "when I first started this treatment, I thought the walking would be my gift to you. But having you beside me, supporting me, loving me through all of this, that's been the real gift." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Just promise me one thing." "Anything." "No more secret medical procedures," she said with a smile. Michael laughed. "I promise. Though I should tell you," he paused dramatically, "I have been secretly practicing our first dance." Sarah's eyes widened. "Michael Thompson, are you telling me?" But he just winked at her, leaving her to wonder what other surprises he had in store for their wedding day. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear. Sarah stood in the bridal room of the church, her white dress flowing perfectly around her. Her mother was fixing her veil while her best friend Lisa applied the final touches to her makeup. "Are you nervous?" Lisa asked, carefully blotting Sarah's lipstick. "Not about marrying Michael," Sarah replied with a smile. "Just hoping everything goes as planned." Though she knew about Michael's ability to walk now, most of the wedding guests didn't. Only their closest family members and the physical therapy team knew what was about to happen. They had practiced the timing countless times, but today would be different. Today was real. In another room of the church, Michael sat in his wheelchair, adjusting his bow tie. Dr. Rodriguez was doing one final check of his legs while his best man, Jake, stood nervously nearby. "Remember, Dr. Rodriguez said, "Don't push yourself too hard. If you need to sit down at any point, that's completely fine." Michael nodded, but his face showed pure determination. "I've been practicing for this moment for 6 months. Nothing's going to stop me from walking to my bride." The church filled with guests, many of them whispering about the special accommodations made for the wheelchair, the ramp leading to the altar, the special space cleared at the front. Some guests still showed surprise at seeing an interracial couple getting married, but the love between Sarah and Michael had long since silenced most critics. Mrs. Thompson sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes already. She had come a long way from her initial disapproval, and now she was one of their biggest supporters. Next to her sat Sarah's parents, who had welcomed Michael into their family from the very beginning. The music started, and the bridesmaids began their walk down the aisle. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The wedding march began to play, and Sarah appeared at the church doors. She looked stunning in her white dress, her dark skin glowing with happiness, her eyes shining with joy and love. As Sarah began her walk down the aisle, guests murmured appreciatively at her beauty. But halfway down, she stopped. This was the signal. At the altar, Jake and Michael's brother David moved to either side of his wheelchair. The church grew quiet, confusion visible on many faces. Then, slowly and steadily, Michael began to rise from his wheelchair. Gasps filled the church as Michael stood upright, using a decorative cane that matched his tuxedo, and with Jake and David close by for support, he took his first steps toward Sarah. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she watched her soon-to-be husband walk toward her. She remembered all the early morning therapy sessions, all the falls, all the moments of doubt, and all the triumphs that had led to this moment. They met in the middle of the aisle, Michael's legs shaking slightly, but his smile radiating pure joy. "I told you I'd walk to you," he whispered. Together, they walked the rest of the way to the altar. There wasn't a dry eye in the church. Even the minister had to pause to compose himself before beginning the ceremony. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, "we are gathered here today to witness not just the union of two hearts, but the triumph of love over every obstacle, of hope over doubt, of faith over fear." During their vows, Michael remained standing, though Sarah could see the effort it took. But his voice never wavered as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her for all their days. When it was time for their first kiss as husband and wife, Michael surprised everyone again. He handed his cane to Jake, and with strength born of love and determination, he wrapped both arms around Sarah and kissed her deeply as their guests erupted in applause and cheers. Later, at the reception, Michael and Sarah shared their first dance. It wasn't perfect. He had to hold her a bit tighter for balance, and their steps were slow and careful, but to everyone watching, it was the most beautiful dance they'd ever seen. "So, Mrs. Thompson," Michael whispered as they swayed together, "was it worth waiting for?" Sarah looked up at her husband, her heart full of love. "Every single second," she replied, and kissed him again. And so began their new life together, a testament to the power of love, determination, and the incredible strength of the human spirit.